In the later part of 2011, Latoya Ammons, her 3 children and her mother Rosa Campbell moved into a small home in the suburbs of Gary, Indiana. It seemed like the ideal place to raise a family, but in reality, things turned out to be a lot different than what they expected. Within just a few days, the family realised that they were not moving into an empty house which they could make their own, but found there was something sinister there that had already made itself at home, and it did not want to share the house with them. Now, stories like this are often dismissed by many as just something imagined, but the interesting thing here is that the Ammons were not the only ones to witness the terror in the house. Many respected members of the community saw things with their own eyes, things they can never forget. It was so bad, it became known as a house of 200 demons. The Ammons family were really excited about the new chapter in their life. In November of 2011, Latoya Ammons and her 3 children, 2 boys aged 7 and 9 and a girl who was 12, and her mother Rosa, pulled up at their new house ready to move in at 3860 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. It was a small home, but big enough for their needs. There are a few similar houses in the same street, a street that's not upscale in any shape or form. It's not in very good condition, and it seems to have been forgotten when it comes to keeping the verges neat and the rubbish removed. Across from the homes is an old building. It was a factory at one time, and it didn't look very nice on the landscape. The children soon settled into their new rooms, with the 2 boys sharing a room, and at first things seemed normal enough. Then one day, a month after moving in December 2011, things began to change. One morning, Latoya woke up to find the front porch infested with a swarm of flies that seemed to have come out of nowhere. There were so many of them, someone from outside would suspect there was something dead and rotting in the home, but that wasn't the case at all. There was not only no strong smells to attract the flies, but they appeared in December when it's so cold outside. Most species of flies hide under the soil or just die. At first, Latoya and Rosie didn't pay much attention to the strange occurrence. They just tried to get rid of the annoying swarms, but no matter what they did, the flies were back the next day, each time worse than before. Eventually, after using many cans of Raid fly spray, the swarms disappeared and there was a sense of relief. They were happy just to have gotten rid of them. But little did they know that the flies were just a warning sign of much worse things to come. Soon the family began to feel very unhappy in a place that should have been a comfortable home for them. One night, when the whole family were asleep in bed, one by one they began to be woken up by the sound of footsteps coming from the basement stairs. At first they tried to ignore them. The footsteps were quite quiet, so they weren't completely sure what they were hearing. But then they grew louder and clearer. They seemed to echo from the basement into the kitchen, then round the whole house. After a while, Latoya and her mother had no option but to check it out. They never found anybody, just an open door, one they always kept shut. They wanted to go down the dark stairs to the basement, but something about looking into the darkness down there made them scared. So they shut and locked the doors and put a chair up against it and went back to bed to try and get some sleep. Up to this point, there were things happening that should not have been happening, but nothing to make them think they were in a haunted house. A few nights later, Latoya was woken up by the creaking sound of her wardrobe door opening.
And I saw one coming into full image. It was coming out of my closet.
It was a large dark shadow person. She watched in disbelief as it left her bedroom and headed towards the living room. At that moment, she was disorientated from being suddenly woken up, and she couldn't believe what she had seen. But she soon came to her senses and jumped up to go after the strange figure. Maybe it was an intruder or one of her children playing a prank. But what she was about to discover would not only shock her, but change the way she looked at the world entirely. She went into the living room and saw the dark figure pacing up and down in the room. She flicked on the light and it disappeared straight away. Although it had gone, it had left behind some muddy footprints. For many people, this would have been the time to pack up and get out of the house once and for all. But the reality was, the family had no other place to go. Latoya talked to her mum about it and said, what is the worst that can actually happen? Of course, the flies, the footsteps, and the sight of the huge shadow figure was scary. But were they harmful? And so far, it hadn't affected the children. But most dark energy hauntings start off fairly harmless, then they escalate. In March of 2012, Latoya and Rosa had a few friends round to mourn the death of a friend. Some of the friends and family decided to stay over due to it being late and having to travel a fair distance. At around 2 a.m, something very scary happened. Latoya was sleeping in her mother's room along with her 12-year-old daughter and a friend. She would never forget what she saw that night. The sight was so shocking she couldn't move. All she could do was scream out to her mother. Rosa would also never forget it. There, in the middle of the bed, Latoya's 12-year-old daughter began floating in the air with the wrinkled bedsheet draped over her body. Of course, everyone in the room was stunned by what they saw, and all they could do was pray. Then the young girl started to slowly come back down. When she woke up, she couldn't remember anything that had happened. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but from then on, nothing was the same. The next day, their visitors went home, and from that moment on, they kept giving excuses as to why they could never visit again. The Ammons family had no choice but to acknowledge that something sinister was in their home. They were so concerned for their safety and that of their children that they called local churches for guidance. Most ignored them, putting it down to imagination, dreams or tricks. Then they found one who was willing to help. The ministers listened carefully to every detail of their story. They quickly came to a clear decision. The Ammons' home had become occupied by something demonic. To find out what this demon was and to protect themselves from the evil spirits, Latoya and her mother followed everything the ministers recommended. They cleaned the house from top to bottom with bleach and ammonia, rubbed olive oil on the hands and feet of the children, and put oil in the shape of the cross on their foreheads. To get even further protection, the women consulted 2 psychics who told them that their home was occupied by no less than 200 demons. The psychics told them that their situation was critical and their only real option was to move out. However, the Ammons were unwilling and unable to follow this advice. It wasn't out of pride. It was simply the fact that they couldn't afford to move. Their only choice was to remove the spirits that had taken up residence in the house, or at least ignore them for as long as possible. So, following the advice of the psychics, Latoya built an altar in the basement. It was a simple one, consisting of a small table covered in a white sheet with candles, statues of the Virgin Mary, Jesus and St. Joseph placed on top of it. She also covered the basement walls with salt. With the help of a friend, she performed a cleansing ritual of the whole house, burning sage, starting at the top floor and going all the way down to the basement. Latoya drew crosses with the smoke of the sage in each room. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the petulance that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that lays waste at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. After this, and for the next 3 days, everything seemed to return to normal. It was like these entities had never been there. But then they reacted. After 3 days of peace, Latoya noticed her children started to act out of character. Sometimes the youngest boy would sit in front of a wardrobe and talk to a child no one else could see, and the topics of his conversations were not very pleasant. He would say, "I've been here long enough. I came to kill and I will kill." He would also describe in detail how it felt to be murdered. On another occasion, Her other son was thrown across the room by something, which caused him to hit his sister, knocking her against a headboard, causing a head injury that required stitches. The young girl told the doctor that she sometimes felt suffocated, that she became unable to speak or move, and she would hear voices that told her she would never see her family again and that she would be dead in 20 minutes. Latoya soon came to the conclusion that she and her children were being possessed. She noticed that her body temperature would begin to rise very quickly. She would shake and feel like she was going to lose consciousness. However, Rosa never felt anything of the sort, and she put this down to the protection of a guardian angel. By April 2012, the two women took the children to see a doctor. When the family entered the doctor's office, he felt an overwhelming feeling of dread, which he tried to ignore. As Latoya began telling her story, the doctor, who was still struggling with his feelings, took notes. Then suddenly the youngest son began to scream and swear aggressively, but the words coming out were not in a child's voice. The voice was deep, guttural and demonic. The child suddenly flew across the room without anyone touching him. The young boy then passed out. His older brother then lost consciousness. The medical staff tried to revive him, but they needed more help. Someone in the office called 911, and within minutes a group of police officers and paramedics rushed the children to the hospital. When the boys eventually woke up, the older one was acting completely normal, but the younger one seemed to have gone crazy. He started screaming, swearing and fighting with such force that it took 3 grown men to restrain him. The hospital room was in chaos, and a hospital worker was convinced the children were being abused and contacted the Department of Child Safety, as Latoya seemed to be suffering from mental illness. The DCS caseworker, Valerie Washington, said in her report that neither Latoya or her children suffered from any health problems, other than the bruises and cuts they say came from the situation at home. A psychiatrist who examined Latoya said she was in sound mental health. Later that day, Valerie Washington and a nurse took Rosa and the children into a small room to interview them without Latoya. The situation didn't change. The younger boy began to growl, stared at his older brother and said in a voice that sounded demonic, "It's time to die. I'm going to kill you." The older boy became very frightened and ran to his grandmother. The younger boy then ran at her and gave a powerful headbutt into her stomach. Rosa would not be intimidated, grabbed hold of the boy's hand and said, "You are not my grandson, you are a demon." The child slowly lifted his head. He had a twisted smile on his face and began to walk backwards until he reached the wall. He then began to walk up the wall, backwards and with ease until he reached the ceiling. He was breathing heavily and had a blank stare in his eyes. The situation was like nothing the hospital staff had encountered before, and now people inside and outside the hospital were certain that a malevolent force was attacking the Ammons family. One of these people was Valerie Washington of the DCS. Latoya and her youngest son spent the night at the hospital, while Rosa took the other 2 children and stayed with a relative. After that, things did calm down a little bit. The next day was the youngest child's 8th birthday. Valerie told Rosa to bring the other children back to the hospital. The family celebrated the birthday with cake and presents, but as soon as the party was over, they received the worst possible news. The DCS were concerned for the family's physical, emotional and spiritual well-being and decided to take custody of the children. Then, on the morning of April the 20th, 2012, Latoya received some unexpected help. The hospital chaplain, who was very concerned about the family's situation, contacted Reverend Michael Magino.
The first time I heard about the incident was when, just after the boy walked up the wall backwards. There was a furor there about people running out, calling for the police, security, the chaplain. He called me.
Reverend Michael had never performed an exorcism, but decided to visit Latoya in her home. The women welcomed him in and hoped that the intervention of a man of God would help solve their problem.
Well, when I went to do the interview at the home with the mother and the grandmother, it was a 4-hour interview. And the first 2 hours were basically just getting information of all the occurrences and phenomena that was surrounding everything leading up to that incident at the emergency room in the hospital.
Michael himself noticed some strange things. He observed some footprints appearing on the living room floor that came out of thin air. Latoya then began to complain of having severe headaches. Thinking the headaches may be related to demonic activity, Michael placed a crucifix on Latoya's forehead and she suddenly began to convulse. After 4 hours of questioning, the Reverend was convinced the family were being tormented by demons and that their home was under their control. He was firm and clear about this and said they were not safe staying there and they had to leave immediately. That same day, Latoya and Rosa moved in with a relative. A week later, the DCS and the police went to the home to determine if it was a safe place for the children. Latoya refused to go inside, so Rosa led the group into the house.
Now let's see if we got anything. Yeah, I don't.
I'm gonna ask.
Yeah. Huh. But they said, they would hear stuff in the basement.
Wait a minute, hold it. Somebody was burning candles back here too. Look.
Oh, wow.
In the basement, Rosa pointed out a patch of earth that she believed was where the demons were entering their home from. The police captain, who was very sceptical, said he probably would believe in spirits, but not demons and not possessions. However, after visiting the home, his feelings began to change. While speaking to Rosa, all the police equipment began to malfunction. One of the officers who recorded the audio of the walk round said when he began to play it back, he swore he heard a disembodied voice in the background. Several photos were taken as well, and some showed silhouettes, hands, and even a disturbing face. But still, they said none of it was concrete evidence. It was absolutely creepy given the circumstances, but these images could be an example of pareidolia, where the brain sees things that aren't really there. Unsure with what they were dealing with, the group returned to the house again a few days later, this time accompanied by more officers and case manager Samantha Healedge, who had replaced Valerie Washington as she refused to return to the house. No one believed her when she said she knew there was some sort of haunting going on. When in the basement, Samantha noticed a strange liquid dripping down the walls. The liquid was slippery and sticky, with a similar consistency of oil. When upstairs in the living room, Samantha felt a strange tingling sensation in her left small finger. After this, her finger turned bright white. Then she had a panic attack and couldn't breathe. The police captain refused to stay in the house any longer and asked if the inspection could be finished up quickly. The police officers upstairs noticed the oil-like substance found in the basement was dripping from the window blinds in the bedrooms. They cleaned the oil off, left the room for 20 minutes, then returned to find the substance had reappeared. After speaking with Reverend Michael, he told them the liquid had to be a demonic manifestation. That night he blessed the house before performing a minor exorcism, one that didn't require the church's approval. He said a prayer to cast out the demons. The two police officers who had accompanied the Reverend claimed the disturbing presence they felt was truly demonic. A week later, Samantha Healedge began to suffer with health problems and terrible accidents. She got third-degree burns from a motorcycle accident, broke 3 ribs while skiing, and fractured her hand and ankle all in the same month. So was she affected by these demons in the same way the Ammons family was? Or was it just a coincidence? Once a minor exorcism was complete, Reverend Michael received permission from his bishop to perform a direct exorcism on Latoya. The ritual would be the same as before, but this time would have the backing of the Catholic Church. Before the ritual started, the Reverend wanted to stand a fighting chance against the demons, so he tried figuring out who they were.
It was pretty much without incident until we get to the part of your name, and you asked for its name. Now, so far she's always been silent. So, and I says, is your name whatever? And then all of a sudden she started convulsing and such. So now once you have a name, you kind of attack.
With the help of Latoya and the church, he believed he had found at least one name, and it just so happened to be one of the 7 princes of hell, also known as the 7 deadly demons. This one represents gluttony and envy. He is often referred to as the Lord of the Flies due to the fact the little insects are often seen when he is around, just like the infestation that was found on Latoya's porch when they first moved in. The Reverend went on to perform 3 exorcisms in total, 2 in English and 1 in Latin. During all of this, Latoya convulsed violently and experienced pain that she said was as intense as childbirth. During the exorcism, many demons were expelled, too many to even count. The Reverend said during the exorcisms he could feel the demons were weakening, and eventually Latoya fell asleep. When she woke up, she did feel a little better. The family then moved to Indianapolis to a house that Reverend Michael had previously blessed. Things weren't easy at first, as Latoya suffered from frequent and intense nightmares, but after a while the nightmares finally stopped and she felt peace. Eventually, a new family moved into the Ammons house, and fortunately this family didn't report any paranormal activity. In November 2012, Latoya regained custody of her children, and although the Indianapolis Department of Child Services monitored them for a while to make sure everything was okay, in January of 2013, the Ammons family were living as a normal family with no input from Child Services. Latoya and Rosa were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief and thank the Reverend and their belief in God for protecting their family. Some people remain sceptical of this entire story, which is to be expected. Some believe it was a hoax. Others believe it was collective hysteria affecting the whole family, the hospital staff, the child services and the police officers involved. But others truly believe that Ammons were the target of sadistic demonic entities that saw there was some vulnerability in that family and decided to descend upon them, but were driven away by something greater than them in the end. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.